Welcome back to Nomad, Echoes of Adventure, the channel where we take deep dives into some of motorcycling's most interesting journeys and characters, from this century and the last, and along the way, discover some that have become lost over time. I'm still Jeff Thomas, and after covering my own ride from England to California in episode 8, here in episode 9, as I pick up where we left off in Boonville, the self-indulgence continues with part 2 of Poor Circulation, Homeward Bound. In part 1, Ashes to Boonville, I literally raced through 20,000 miles in 20 minutes and missed out much of the good stuff. But here in part 2, Homeward Bound, the mood and the speed of the journey should change. To make sense of Homeward Bound, you should probably go back and watch Ashes to Boonville, so I'll leave a link in the description below. But if this were an elevator pitch, well, Northern England, 1962, a child born out of wedlock is adopted by the Thomas family and given the name Jeff. Without a family car, George and Barbara ride a Triumph motorcycle with a sidecar attached for Jeff and his brother Alan. The Triumph sparks Jeff's love of motorbikes, and reading Jupiter's Travels as a teenager sparks his interest in travel. After travelling widely in his 20s, returning to England and travelling 1,000,000 miles as a London dispatch rider isn't really the kind of travelling he'd dreamed of. In 1998, cancer came for George Thomas, and in 2007, when it came for his mother Barbara, there'd been two things she'd wished could have happened in her lifetime. In 2008, after selling his world on eBay, Jeff straps his parents' ashes onto his motorbike and sets off to ride around the world on it. And, after riding together down the magnificent Pacific Coast Highway on a Triumph, in Boonville, California, George is reunited with his grandchildren that he never met. George and Barbara will be sharing a 2-acre parcel of land in Boonville with Alan and Tori, their children Sam and Willow, 2 cows, Watermelon and Bramble, 2 lambs, Marshmallow and Jackie, 3 pigs all called George, several chickens, and a trio of ducks that seem to be called Thanks, Giving and Dinner. For a town of just 715 people, Boonville has a surprising amount of shit. It has its own airport, its own brewery, its own famous hotel, and even its own language, Boontling. Dyslexia, do you have Boontling in your language banks?
Good morning, hapless Jeff. Of course, I have knowledge of all known languages. Would you like to hear an example of Boontling?
Yes, but please keep it clean.
Before can Hickey Boots Levi, a wheeler on the Bucky Walter, Brightlighters, a Bellman Bluch. Roughly translated, that means, I hope local Boonvillians won't get angry with me on the phone, because the city girl is only teasing you.
You can't make this shit up, and over the years, Boonville has been home to Jim Jones of Jonestown infamy, serial killers Charles Manson and Charles Ung, Young Un Kim of the Moonies, Alice Walker of The Colour Purple, Bonnie Raitt, the Angel from Montgomery, and Ted Simon of Jupiter's Travels. Yes, after dreaming of Jupiter, Jupiter had found love and moved to Boonville, and with a world population of 7 billion people, me finding the man who'd seeded my wanderlust in a town of just 700 people was, by my maths, a chance of 1 in 10 million. I should have bought a fucking lottery ticket. But even though Ted Simon had moved away from Boonville a year earlier, for such a well-travelled man, he hadn't gone very far. He'd moved a few miles away to the equally small town of Covelo, but when I dropped by unannounced to see him, sadly, he hadn't been home. I'd later go on to ride with him in California and share a few bottles of Pinot Noir, and I'd be there to celebrate his 80th birthday. But as I'd ridden away from Boonville that year, I'd realised that the thing that made America so appealing to so many people had also been something of a curse. Few people would argue that choice wasn't a good thing. But with 6 weeks remaining on my US visa and a free pass to all of its national parks, the choice has actually been too much. All of my planning had been around getting to Boonville, and my only plan for leaving it had been to ride across the country east and find the cheapest way of getting back to England. Now, the United Kingdom is rich with history, but after looking at a map and marking the places I'd needed to see, I would have gladly swapped some of our darker periods in history for some of the United States' rich geographical splendour. The choice was overwhelming. Take coffee. It can be flavoured with anything, sweetened with anything. And unless you've got an hour to kill, Never ask a barista what kind of milk they have. It's the same with their national parks and monuments. But as the presidential race began heating up, it seemed strange that Americans didn't demand the same degree of choice in their politicians or the media outlets that covered them. Had I known that Sarah Palin had been watching from Alaska with her binoculars, I would have waved at her from Zarabino. And don't get me wrong, it was good that she'd identified a gap in her understanding of Russia. And as she clearly wasn't a big reader, I can understand why she'd taken a more visual approach. When it comes to Russia, her colleague John McCain had seemed, well, more intent on fighting than looking. But as the man who'd suggested bombing Iran, that shouldn't have been too surprising to anybody. John McCain and Sarah Palin just seemed like a curious but intellectually uncurious pairing. And why so many people seem to prefer them to the well-spoken, well-read, well-educated, scandal-free former president of the Harvard Law Review, Barack Obama, I really wouldn't like to say. A good portion of the media seemed to think that Obama had been born in Canada, or was it Kenya? Well, I'm sure they asked McCain, Palin and Biden to produce their birth certificates as well, but many seemed to think that Obama was a Muslim, and that as a Democrat and a socialist, he'd obviously sympathised with Al-Qaeda. To me, that seemed strange, because having been in the Middle East during the arse end of Operation Cyclone, I know for a fact that Charlie Wilson wasn't a work of fiction, and that Charlie Wilson and John McCain were neither Muslims, Democrats, socialists, nor perhaps more importantly, strangers to the Mujahideen or each other. What a strange world we do enjoy. But even though I'd ridden away from Boonville with a dozen pins in my map, leaving politics behind me would be difficult. Skipping between national parks, I'd started questioning everything I'd seen, like a British Bill Bryson. Okay is probably the world's most spoken word, but for me, the most frequent word became what? It was just a single word, a pronoun, an adverb, one of Kipling's 6 honest serving men. But the further I'd travelled inland, the more it became a sentence, a paragraph, an entire dissertation on the state of the world's most powerful nation. Americans say fanny pack and Revolutionary War, while we Brits say bumbag and War of Independence, none of which I have a problem with. And although both sides accept that the 4th of July is Independence Day, I was beginning to wonder if Downsizing Day might have been a little more appropriate. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly still the land of opportunity. But at the risk of dissing the famously litigious Kardashians, I think it's only in the United States of America where so little talent can go so fucking far. On my first night at California's Lake Tahoe, on a small camping pitch next to Muriel and Mark, 2 voluntary evacuees from Los Angeles, I'd witnessed a living metaphor of 21st century USA. For the first 3 nights out of Boonville, I'd gone south to San Francisco, and then back north to Lassen Volcanic Park, and then spent the 3rd night at Clear Lake. I'd enjoyed all 3, and arriving at the campground on Lake Tahoe, it was already getting dark. At 7,000 feet, it was also cold, and Muriel and Mark, who'd been camped on the site next to mine, hadn't brought any firewood. They'd shared the warmth of mine, and we'd shared each other's beers and stories. I guessed they were father and daughter, and that Muriel had inherited her looks from her mother. But I'd been wrong. They were a couple. Mark was from LA, by day an engineer, and by night a musician. However, as the engineering firm had just laid him off, by then he'd just been an out-of-work musician. Muriel played behind Mark, and seemed to spend her days at casting sessions for movies, TV shows and commercials, and they'd been together for a year. We'd laughed and joked and watched a media shower above us, and they'd sung and played guitar beautifully, everything from Dido to Dylan. All in all, it could have been another perfect California evening. Becoming disillusioned with their life in LA, they'd abandoned their rented apartment, taken a car belonging to Muriel's father, and gone searching for their spiritual home. But as the night progressed, and Mark began searching for his own spiritual home in a bottle of Jack Daniels, and then a small ceramic pipe, the mood of the camp began changing. By the time the Jack Daniels was gone, Mark had become the kind of drunk I'd left behind in England. In the space of a few minutes, we'd gone from, "You Brits are great," to "You're going to die." Because I was older, shorter, and lighter, Mark probably hadn't put much effort into his hay baler, but he'd certainly telegraphed it. The altercation was over in seconds, and within minutes, Mark had been escorted back to his tent to sleep it off. And when an hour later, I'd heard the zip on my own tent being opened, there'd been a pretty little thing coming for the king down in the jungle room. Tempting as it was, I'd declined Muriel's offer of warmth and comfort. It was Mark who'd needed the attention, and I certainly hadn't needed the trouble. And by the time they'd woken in the morning, I'd already been halfway to Yosemite. Since entering the USA, I'd seen Mount Rainier, Crater Lake, California's giant redwoods, Lassen Volcanic Park, and Lake Tahoe. But entering Yosemite via Mono Lake had been the perfect opening scene for a place that seemed even more beautiful. It's just something that strikes you, and even though I'd seen the photographs, the scale, the beauty, the perfection had just left me speechless. It was cold, but with cloudless skies it really hadn't mattered, and as I'd ridden what must have been every road in the park, my opinion of Yosemite had only improved. I'd camped inside the park, my small tent and triumph dwarfed not only by the geography, but also by the multi-wheeled mobile mansions that surrounded me. Americans don't do geography like us Brits, and they certainly don't do camping like us. But thankfully, despite the camping grounds being crowded, the roads had been relatively quiet. Yosemite was spoiling me. And then so too had Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Forest. And continuing towards Mount Whitney, it had felt like I'd been riding through a movie set. Everything looked familiar, like a team of Hollywood set designers had been travelling a day ahead of me. I could almost smell the wet paint. But dropping down from Mount Whitney, the highest point in the lower 48 states, to Badwater Basin, the lowest point, the beauty of Death Valley had been one of the biggest surprises of the journey. It was barren, but beautiful, and it's difficult to explain why, but with no traffic on the roads, it felt like I'd had Death Valley all to myself. Of course it was hot, but to an Englishman, everywhere south of London's hot, but after 25 countries, Death Valley had been the first place that actually looked like it could have been on a different planet. Of course it hadn't been, but having assumed that it would be just one road running through a barren desert, to find twisting tarmac and winding dirt trails had certainly added to the character. It was beautiful and peaceful, but when the following evening I'd arrived in Las Vegas, well, I really had been entering an entirely different world. After the open roads and national parks, Las Vegas was bright, brash, loud, and extremely vulgar. Arriving at night, the neon signs had all looked familiar, like I'd been on another movie set, but Las Vegas wasn't a movie I'd ever want to watch a second time. I'd always intended to walk into a casino and place $100 on red, just as Austin Vince had done years earlier, but after stopping to take pictures on the Strip, an enterprising ticket tout had actually offered me a job. I left London to avoid a job, so it's ironic that I found one in Las Vegas. But when Jerry offered me $50 to stand on the Strip for 2 hours chatting with passers-by, it seemed too good to refuse. I'd been interested in the money, and as a seller of same-day tickets for big shows, Jerry had been interested in the stationary audience that me and the Tiger would create. I certainly hadn't felt proud, but after 2 hours of entertaining strangers, I'd slipped 3 $20 bills into my pocket, and later that night, after eating and paying for a cheap motel room, there'd still been $200 in my pocket. Roulette was the only game I'd played, but even though red had worked well for me, it wasn't something that I'd ever want to repeat. Being around Jerry and the casinos had actually made me feel grubby, and I hadn't been sorry to watch Las Vegas disappearing in my mirrors. I'd been heading for the Grand Canyon, but after crossing the Hoover Dam and going south onto Highway 93, the name Kingman on the road sign had sounded familiar. A few miles further south, the name Peach Springs had meant nothing, but the road listed beneath it had meant everything. I'd stumbled onto Route 66, probably the world's most famous road, and Nat King Cole was already singing in my ear. I had to come across it at some point, but the contrast between the glitz of Las Vegas and the gloom of Route 66 had been stark. With the development of the highways, Many of Route 66's communities had been bypassed and obviously fallen into decline. The smaller towns had been quiet, ghost towns where the gold had gone, but the abandoned gas stations lining the route had reminded me of other movies, particularly the ones that involved zombies. Organisations like the Route 66 Historical Society had been trying to breathe new life into Route 66, and the movie cars had apparently been very helpful, so hopefully it won't remain on a ventilator for too long. Just as the Trans-Siberian Railway had been in Siberia, as I'd ridden towards exiting the USA, Route 66 and the Santa Fe Railway became my regular companions. I've lingered everywhere too long, and with days on my 90-day visa exemption running short, despite the vastness of the Grand Canyon and beauty of Bryce Canyon doing their best to hold on to me for longer, as summer fades in my mirrors, I start turning north towards New York. Through the Great Smoky Mountains, I ride the tail of the dragon, and thankfully avoid adding any tiger parts to the Tree of Shame, and then spend a day as Dale Walker's guest at the Wheels Through Time Museum in Maggie Valley. The days are getting shorter, and as the temperature falls, the temptation to turn south for winter begins rising. Instead, I'm heading north in the general direction of New York, and the trucks and trailers alongside me on the road are no longer recreational vehicles rented from Cruise America, but relocation vehicles from U-Haul and Hertz. It's 2 weeks to Election Day, 5 weeks since Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, and America's on the move. Passing through towns, every yard has either a pumpkin display for Halloween or a sale of life's possessions. And with the economy falling faster than the temperature, the stories I hear at filling stations are of people abandoning their dream homes and moving back home to live with their parents. Along the way there'd been Memphis, which I'd hated, Graceland, which I'd avoided, and Nashville, which I'd loved. But as I'd continued heading north towards New York, the prospect of returning to life in an English winter hadn't filled me with joy. Flying with a bike from New York to London had always been an assumption rather than a plan, but discovering that US law would prevent us from sharing the same aircraft had certainly been a surprise. When I'd asked why, I'd received vague references to new rules. But after realising that flying home from Canada would not only be easier, but also an awful lot cheaper, I'd been happy to discover that Toronto had only been a few hundred miles north of New York. Motorcycle Express, the company aiding my exit, were based on Long Island, and without a credit card, I'd needed to deliver a fistful of dollars to their offices. That meant riding across Manhattan, where a dealership on 6th Avenue had offered to replace the Tiger's balding rear tyre. But despite that offer turning out to be a lot more troublesome than expected, crossing the city had been a lot easier than I'd imagined. God bless America's city planners, and God bless Motorcycle Express for delivering everything they'd promised. The act of purchasing the ticket and completing the paperwork had been a physical reminder that my time on the road had been coming to an end, and even though flying from Toronto would add another few hundred miles to the journey, before I'd known it, I'd arrived in the town of Niagara, which for me would mark the end of my journey through the United States. Arriving in a town at night, you don't always see the best side of it, but Niagara certainly wasn't what I'd imagined. Maybe the pictures I'd seen had all been taken on the Canadian side, because the American side just looked downtrodden and glum, and when the following day I'd ridden across the Rainbow International Bridge into Canada, things had certainly looked different. It's difficult to explain, but Canada just seemed to care more, and within 2 hours of dragging myself away from the majesty of Niagara Falls, I'd arrived on the outskirts of Toronto. It had been time to part company with the Tiger, and when I'd arrived at the Air Transat facility on the perimeter of Toronto's airport, the Tiger hadn't wanted to leave. In order to fly, the bike's battery had needed to be disconnected, but to the professionals at Air Cargo Services, the resulting beep from the immobiliser hadn't been acceptable. It wasn't good news, and after taking the Tiger to a distant edge of their car park and disconnecting the immobiliser, the piercing wail that replaced the passive bleeps had taken 5 minutes to kill with a fucking hammer. Fortunately, before leaving London, I'd bought a loopback plug from Triumph, so with the immobiliser in the dumpster, I'd been able to rewire the system and restart the bike. Flying home to London with a defenceless motorbike wouldn't be ideal, but as the screaming alarm had created little more than idle curiosity, I'm not sure how much of a deterrent it would have been anyway. Hopefully, after making it around the world, the Tiger wouldn't return to London only to get stolen. But after taking the bus to the nearest reasonably priced motel, I'd prepared for my final night away from England. It was November the 4th, 2008, the day of the United States of America's presidential election. And after finding a late-night bar, it seemed that the USA's Canadian neighbours had been reasonably pleased with the outcome. Before arranging my return flight to England, I'd never heard of Air Transat. But just 7 hours after leaving Toronto, I'd landed safely back in England, and an hour later had been reunited with the Tiger. The return to Gatwick Airport had been painless, and after heading out onto the M25 and crossing the Thames, I'd ridden to the Essex village of Great Sailing, the place that I'd formerly called home. I say formerly because do you remember the email I received from my daughter? The one I'd been reading in Irkutsk while a group of kids had been picking my pockets? Well, it hadn't been a joke, and while I'd been gadding about in the wilds of Siberia, my old apartment back in England had indeed been destroyed by fire. Thankfully, nobody had been hurt in the fire, and as part 1 of Poor Circulation was Ashes to Boonville, maybe I should call part 2 Boonville to Ashes instead of Homeward Bound. Anyway, on that day, Friday the 7th of November 2008, everything I'd owned in life had been either in my pockets, on my back, or strapped to the Triumph Tiger. It hadn't been a lot to show for 45 years of life, but in a strange way it had actually felt quite liberating. I'd had no property, but I'd also had no debts, and so with nothing to hold me back, I'd engaged first gear and decided to keep on riding until what little money I had left had finally run out. After riding 28,000 miles through 28 countries in 28 weeks, I'd learned that in different regions of the world, money had very different values, and that the faster you moved, the higher the costs would be. It wasn't the cost of fuel that killed budgets, but the tourist cost of living. And lingering longer in less well-travelled areas had given me time to seek out the bargains. So, after returning to the Ace Cafe and completing a full circle of the world, I'd left the Triumph with friends, arranged my belongings into a package weighing 23 kilograms, and set out on what would become the third part of Poor Circulation. There'd been a financial contribution from family in Boonville, and I'd received payments for articles I'd been writing for various magazines. And with that, I'd had enough money for 2 months on the road, possibly 3 if I was really careful. And then, with a cheque from the Rider's Digest covering the cost of a flight to Thailand, I'd become the accidental nomad, a position I've somehow managed to maintain and transformed that 2 or 3 months into a decade. Anyway, like the names of those who travelled along with me at the time, thanks for coming along on this ride. And if there's a particular character or journey that interests you, then leave a message and let's see where it takes us. So once again, I've been your host, Jeff Thomas, encouraging you to ride safe, leaving more smiles and miles behind you.
And I have been Dyslexa, also hoping that you've enjoyed this hapless adventurer's low-budget journey around the world. And for my Boonville friends, Lush dehigt mosh pike to de Kahoot. Thank you.
So until next time, bye-bye now.